On the morning of July 21st, 2026, 13 provincial and territorial leaders sat down in a conference room in Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island, expecting to talk about wildfires burning across northern Ontario, about healthcare funding, about energy corridors. Within hours, none of that mattered. A single announcement out of Washington had just detonated across the meeting, and every premier in that room knew it before lunch. Donald Trump had signed 3 separate proclamations under a tariff law that hadn't been touched in 70 years. Canada's carefully planned summer summit had just become something else entirely, a war room. This is the story of how a routine meeting in Charlottetown turned into the most consequential trade standoff Canada has faced in a generation, and why, weeks later, Ottawa is still refusing to fold. To understand why that Monday morning hit so hard, you have to go back further than most people realize. This didn't start in July. It started more than a year earlier, when the Trump administration began reshaping how it treats its northern neighbor. Steel and aluminum tariffs of up to 50% were already sitting on Canadian exporters. A 25% tariff on automobiles had already reordered supply chains across Ontario's manufacturing belt. Lumber from British Columbia was already facing a 10% duty, with furniture makers absorbing another 25% on top of that. Canada, in turn, had matched some of that pressure. Provinces pulled American liquor off store shelves, and Ottawa placed caps on U.S. vehicle exports into the Canadian market. By the time officials sat down to review the Canada-United States-Mexico agreement, the trade relationship was already fraying at the edges. That review, required every 6 years under the deal, ended without the United States agreeing to renew the agreement in its existing form. According to the White House's own fact sheet, President Trump determined that Canada was not sufficiently beneficial to American interests, and that set the stage for what came next. What came next arrived without warning, timed almost perfectly to coincide with the one gathering where Canada's premiers are together in one room, away from Ottawa, meant to project unity. On July 20th, President Trump invoked Section 338 of the Tariff Act of 1930, a provision so old and so rarely used that trade lawyers had to go back decades to find precedent for it. According to the law firm Wiley, which tracked the announcement in real time, Section 338 had not been used or even seriously threatened in at least 70 years. It allows a president to impose duties of up to 50% on a country the administration believes is discriminating against American exporters. In 3 separate proclamations, Trump named dairy, alcoholic beverages, and motor vehicles as the 3 sectors where Canada was allegedly disadvantaging American businesses. The tariffs, according to the Office of the U.S. Trade Representative, would hit close to $20 billion in Canadian goods annually. Everything from wine and hockey sticks to cement, furniture, and wigs. And in a detail that stunned trade lawyers, these new duties would apply even to goods that fully complied with the existing USMCA agreement. Compliance with the trade deal, in other words, would no longer be a shield. To fully appreciate how unusual this moment was, it helps to remember where this relationship stood just 18 months earlier. Back in January of 2025, before Trump had even been sworn in for his second term, he was already threatening to use what he called economic force against Canada, floating the idea, repeatedly and often mockingly, that Canada should simply become the 51st American state. He referred to then Prime Minister Justin Trudeau publicly as the governor of what he called the great state of Canada, a jab that Trudeau's own premiers were forced to respond to in real time. David Eby, then just beginning his push to coordinate a national response, told reporters that he and his fellow premiers intended to travel to Washington to try to talk Trump out of his tariff plans directly, warning that the proposed duties would raise prices for American consumers on everything from homes to electricity. Those early tariff threats were framed at the time around fentanyl and border security. By the time Trump's second term was underway, that justification had shifted decisively toward trade imbalances, and the tariffs that followed were no longer threats. They were policy. Layered on top of the sector-specific tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and lumber was another measure that often gets lost in the noise. In mid-July of 2026, the U.S. Trade Representative's Office finalized a separate investigation into 60 foreign economies, including Canada, concluding that none of them had adequately enforced prohibitions on imports tied to forced labor. As a result, starting July 24, 2026, a 10% tariff applied broadly to imports from countries the U.S. judged to have committed to forced labor enforcement standards, while countries that hadn't made that commitment faced a slightly steeper 12.5% rate. Canadian goods that were fully CUSMA compliant were exempted from that particular measure, but it added yet another layer to an already complicated tariff picture. One more data point suggesting the Trump administration viewed tariffs not as a single lever, but as a stack of overlapping tools it could deploy simultaneously. The timing was not lost on anyone in Charlottetown. As CBC News reported, the announcement landed on the Monday just before the Premier's 3-day annual summer meeting was set to begin, and it immediately reshuffled every item on the agenda. healthcare transfers, economic growth strategies, and the wildfires tearing through northern Ontario, all of it got pushed to the margins. Trump, as one CBC report put it plainly, was about to take up all the oxygen in the room. By Wednesday, July 22nd, Canada's premiers were no longer meeting to plan provincial priorities. They were meeting to plan a counterattack. According to CTV News, the premiers gathered specifically to hash out demands they intended to bring to the federal government, understanding that whatever consensus they built in Charlottetown would shape Ottawa's negotiating position for weeks to come. This wasn't a symbolic gesture. Provinces control levers. The federal government cannot simply override liquor sales, procurement rules, energy exports, and without the premiers on the same page, any deal Ottawa struck with Washington risked falling apart at the provincial level. The next day, Thursday, July 23rd, Prime Minister Mark Carney arrived in Charlottetown to meet with all 13 premiers directly. The meeting ran 4 hours. When it wrapped, Carney stood in front of reporters and delivered a message aimed as much at Washington as at the Canadian public. Yes, we are intensifying our negotiations with the United States in pursuit of a comprehensive agreement that addresses all tariff-related sectors, he said, framing the moment as proof that, in his words, the Federation was working as it should. It was a carefully chosen phrase, an attempt to project unity in a country that, on trade, doesn't always agree on strategy, let alone tactics. And that disagreement showed almost immediately. Inside the room, according to CBC's reporting, the question of how hard to hit back had become a genuine pressure point among the premiers themselves. Ontario Premier Doug Ford emerged as the loudest voice for aggressive retaliation. Ford had already posted publicly that if the new tariffs proceeded, Canada should respond tariff for tariff, dollar for dollar. In Charlottetown, he went further, pushing for Canada to consider withholding potash and oil exports as leverage, tools he described as capable of helping dismantle the American economic position. Ford's frustration with the unpredictability of the negotiations was obvious. It's very hard to deal with President Trump when he changes his mind every single day, he told reporters, capturing a sentiment that seemed to be shared, quietly, by more than one premier in that room. Not every leader wanted the same posture, though. Saskatchewan Premier Scott Moe struck a notably different tone. Even while acknowledging what he called layers upon layers of tariffs Trump had imposed or threatened against the country, Moe expressed optimism that a deal could be reached in the near term. He framed the Charlottetown meeting as an opportunity for Canada's negotiating team to intensify talks toward a renewed CUSMA agreement, adding that he was bullish, even if, in his own words, not entirely confident we'll get there. That split, Ford's combative posture against Moe's cautious hope, would come to define the tension inside Canada's own coalition in the weeks that followed. Carney, for his part, refused to rule anything out. Asked directly whether Canada was prepared to retaliate if no deal was reached before Trump's new tariffs took effect, he told reporters that everything is on the table, depending on the outcome of the negotiations. It was a deliberately open-ended answer, designed to preserve leverage without committing Canada to a specific countermove it might not be able to follow through on. Meanwhile, the practical details of what Trump's new measures would actually touch were becoming clearer by the day. According to Al Jazeera's reporting, the new 50% tariffs would exempt oil, gas, critical minerals, and potash, the very products Doug Ford wanted to use as leverage, along with goods already covered by existing sector-specific tariffs. The White House justified the entire package as a response to what it called Canadian discrimination against American products in the dairy, alcohol, and auto sectors. Its fact sheet pointed specifically to Canadian quotas on vehicles imported from the U.S., arguing that those quotas pressured American automakers into shifting production north of the border instead of investing at home. Canada, the White House claimed, was the only country besides China to have retaliated against earlier rounds of Trump tariffs, pulling American alcohol from shelves, offering the European Union better access to its dairy market than it offered the U.S., and capping vehicle exports from American-owned companies operating in Canada. Prime Minister Carney rejected that framing outright. In a public statement, he described Trump's new tariffs as the latest in a series of unilateral U.S. trade actions that he argued violated the spirit of existing agreements between the two countries. It set up a familiar pattern that would repeat itself through the weeks that followed. Washington insisting Canada was the aggressor, Ottawa insisting it was the target. From Charlottetown, the story didn't fade. It accelerated. The 30-day clock attached to Trump's Section 338 proclamations meant the new 50% tariffs were set to take effect on August 19, 2026, giving both governments a hard deadline and almost no room to stall. What followed was one of the most intense stretches of shuttle diplomacy between Ottawa and Washington in years. Canada's Trade Minister, Dominic LeBlanc, became the face of that effort, meeting repeatedly with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer in Washington. By mid-August, according to Reuters, reporting picked up by Quartz, LeBlanc and Greer had already met 3 times in as many weeks. with Canada's chief trade negotiator, Janice Charette, present at the table for each round. After one session, LeBlanc posted publicly that Canada remained committed at the negotiating table and would continue to work diligently to advance and staunchly defend Canadian interests. Behind the diplomatic language, though, sources briefed reporters on what was actually being demanded. Items on the table included eliminating Canada's retaliatory auto tariffs entirely, lifting provincial bans on American alcohol sales, and restructuring how licenses were allocated within Canada's supply-managed dairy sector. Trade analyst Derek Burney, associate David McNaughton, a former Canadian ambassador to the United States, told reporters that any lasting resolution would likely require Trump and Carney to negotiate directly, arguing that Greer alone was not in a position to do a deal. The stakes were not abstract. If no agreement was reached, the new tariffs stood to hit somewhere between $20 and $28 billion worth of Canadian exports, according to industry estimates cited by courts. A report from the Canadian American Business Council, cited by Retail Insider Canada, warned that a full breakdown in trade talks could put as many as 102,000 Canadian jobs at risk. Bank of Canada. Governor Tiff Macklem added his own warning to the mix, saying publicly that the tariffs were already weighing on business investment, consumer confidence, and inflation expectations across the country, even before the newest round had formally taken effect. There was also a growing consumer-facing dimension to this story that often gets overshadowed by the bigger geopolitical headlines. Reporting from Yahoo Finance Canada, drawing on industry sources, pointed out that not every concession being discussed in Washington was actually within the federal government's power to deliver. Restocking American alcohol on Canadian store shelves, for instance, is a provincial responsibility, not a federal one, meaning that even if Ottawa agreed to it as part of a broader deal, the actual rollout would depend on each province separately and could end up happening unevenly across the country if it happened at all. Some premiers, again including British Columbia's David Eby, had already signaled they had no intention of reversing their alcohol bans, regardless of what Ottawa negotiated. For everyday Canadian consumers, analysts cautioned not to expect a dramatic drop in alcohol prices, even if the bans were lifted, since the bans had mainly reduced product selection rather than driving prices up in the first place. On the auto side, the calculus was different. If tariffs on vehicles came down as part of a new agreement, that had the potential to meaningfully affect car prices and inventory for Canadian buyers who had, in some cases, quietly paused their purchasing plans while the 25% retaliatory tariff on American-made vehicles remained in place. On the American side, economists were sounding similar alarms about the cost to U.S. consumers. KPMG's chief economist Diane Swank wrote in a note picked up by NBC News that tariffs, once treated as one-off shocks, were now hitting sequentially, compounding inflation pressures that were already complicating the broader economic picture heading into next year. Evercore analysts, in their own note, argued that regardless of whether every threatened tariff actually took effect, Trump was signaling that he believed he now had a durable new tool for negotiating leverage and intended to keep using it. Back in Canada, the political temperature kept rising. Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre wrote directly to Carney in mid-August, publicly calling on the Prime Minister to show what he termed backbone as the negotiations intensified. Poilievre argued that Canadians deserved what he called a good deal, one that included zero tariffs on softwood lumber, an end to sectoral tariffs on steel and aluminum, a tariff-free auto arrangement, and full Canadian access to Buy America procurement rules at every level of government. No more pursuing policies of a managed decline at home, Poilievre wrote. No more caving. It was a pointed political jab, but it also reflected a broader anxiety inside Canada that months of talks might still end in disappointment. That anxiety wasn't unfounded. On August 12th, CBC News reported, citing two sources familiar with the negotiations, that Canada and the United States were not yet at a point where a deal could realistically be reached, and that Canadian officials were explicitly unsatisfied with the latest American proposal. According to those sources, the U.S. had floated a new offer that would lower some of the existing sectoral tariffs, but not by enough to satisfy Ottawa's negotiating team. Industry sources told CBC that Canada was nonetheless preparing to make certain concessions, including potentially an end to the provincial bans on American alcohol, in exchange for meaningful tariff relief. Not every province was on board with that idea, though. British Columbia Premier David Eby made clear that regardless of what Ottawa agreed to in Washington, there was no chance American alcohol would return to BC's provincially run liquor store shelves. It was a direct reminder that Carney's federal negotiating team didn't actually control every lever needed to deliver on a deal. Some of the most symbolically important concessions rested entirely with the premiers themselves. Quebec added its own complications to the picture. Premier Christine Frichette's office indicated that the province would be looking for reduced tariffs on aluminum without giving up significant ground on dairy protections, a balancing act that underscored just how differently each province's economic interests were shaping what winning even meant in this negotiation. Goldie Hyder, CEO of the Business Council of Canada, summed up the challenge bluntly, noting that resolving even a single issue like the alcohol bans required building a coalition palatable to policymakers across Canada of different political stripes. That, Hyder said, underscores the difficulty of governing our country as a federation. Analysts watching this from outside government were increasingly framing the fight not just as a single deadline to survive, but as a preview of a much longer economic shift. A piece published in Policy magazine in early August argued that Trump didn't invent America's turn toward economic nationalism. He accelerated a trend already building around strategic competition with China, anxiety over supply chains, and domestic industrial policy. The analysis suggested that tariffs, once treated by both governments as temporary bargaining chips to be negotiated away, were increasingly becoming a permanent fixture of American economic policy, one likely to outlast Trump's own presidency. That same analysis noted that the tariff fight was quietly undercutting Carney's own efforts to attract foreign investment into Canada, a pitch he was expected to make more forcefully at a Canada Investment Summit scheduled for September. The piece argued that Canada's best strategy going forward wasn't simply to win this one deadline, but to trade reversible measures for reversible measures, while reserving permanent concessions only for gains that were durable and genuinely enforceable, a distinction that mattered because a rushed deal struck under deadline pressure risked locking in concessions Canada might not be able to walk back later, even if the political winds shifted in Washington. Governor Macklem's warnings, delivered through the Bank of Canada, added another layer of urgency to that argument. He specifically flagged that the uncertainty itself, not just the tariffs that had already landed, but the open-ended threat of more to come, was weighing on business investment decisions across the country, making companies hesitant to commit capital to expansion while the rules of trade with their largest customer kept shifting. That kind of chilling effect on investment, economists have long noted, can be more economically damaging over time than the tariffs themselves because it's harder to reverse. A factory that never gets built doesn't restart just because a tariff gets lifted 6 months later. By the second week of August, with the clock ticking toward the August 19th deadline, negotiations had visibly accelerated. The Globe and Mail reported that the outline of a possible deal was beginning to take shape. Under the terms being discussed, the United States would lower its tariffs on Canadian autos, steel, aluminum, and forest products in exchange for Canada agreeing to drop its retaliatory tariffs, end the provincial alcohol bans, and revise its Buy Canadian procurement policies. Crucially, Trump would also agree to walk back the threat of the new 50% tariffs on electronics, alcohol, and dairy, the very measures that had upended the Charlottetown summit weeks earlier. On the specific question of autos, sources told the Globe and Mail that the U.S. had offered to lower its tariff from 25% down to 15%, while maintaining an exemption tied to the value of American-made content inside Canadian-built vehicles. Canadian negotiators pushed back, arguing that even 15% remained, in their assessment, unsurvivable for the auto sector, and demanding a broader exemption covering all content made anywhere inside the USMCA trade zone, not just American-made parts. It's worth noting that this wasn't the first time the two leaders had tried to put a firm timeline on ending the trade war. Back in June, on the sidelines of the G7 summit in Kananaskis, Alberta, Carney and Trump had agreed publicly to pursue a deal within 30 days. Trump told reporters at the time that he was confident the two countries could work something out, and Carney posted that he was looking forward to continuing that work through the summit and beyond. That 30-day window came and went without a final agreement, which is part of why, by the time August rolled around, there was a visible undercurrent of skepticism among some Canadians about whether any deadline attached to these talks could really be trusted to hold. It's a pattern that repeated more than once. Deadlines set, deadlines passed, negotiations extended, and it's part of the context worth keeping in mind whenever a new date gets attached to this story. That skepticism showed up directly in the negotiations themselves. On August 13th and 14th, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer told reporters that both Trump and Carney would soon be presented with what he called options following that round of talks. Language that suggested no single path forward had yet been agreed upon even at the working level, and that the final call would ultimately rest with the two leaders themselves rather than their negotiating teams. Sources briefed on the talks told CBC News that the American side was also pushing for preferential access to Canadian critical minerals as part of any broader package, alongside provisions touching on security cooperation and energy. An indication that even if a narrower tariff deal got signed before the August 19th deadline, it likely wouldn't resolve every outstanding tension between the two countries. Those same sources noted that Canadian negotiators had, in blunt terms, told their American counterparts there would be little political appetite among Canadians to keep negotiating in good faith if the August 19th tariffs actually took effect. A signal that Ottawa saw the deadline itself as a genuine breaking point, not just another milestone to negotiate past. There was also a warning embedded quietly in the negotiations. According to the Globe and Mail, Canada's chief negotiator, Janice Charette, told her American counterparts directly that if the new Section 338 tariffs actually took effect on August 19th, Canada would consider that a breaking point, one that would halt negotiations altogether and shift the country toward retaliation instead of further talks. A Canadian official, speaking on condition of anonymity, reiterated Carney's earlier pledge that all retaliatory options remained on the table. Prime Minister Carney, meanwhile, was managing the political optics of the moment carefully. He spent much of the second week of August on a personal holiday in Italy, returning to Ottawa on the evening of Sunday, August 16th, just 3 days before the deadline. His office insisted he remained in constant contact with negotiators throughout the trip. On his first day back, rather than leading with the trade file, Carney instead traveled to St. John's, Newfoundland, to announce a new hydroelectric agreement involving Quebec and Newfoundland and Labrador tied to the Churchill Falls project, telling reporters that was, in his words, the most important thing happening this week in Canada. It was a notable choice, one that some analysts read as an attempt to project calm and control rather than crisis, even as the tariff deadline loomed just 2 days away. That calm was tested almost immediately. On Monday, August 17th, LeBlanc and Charette sat down again with U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer in Washington, their third meeting in as many weeks. When the meeting wrapped, Greer offered reporters nothing more than a curt no comment as he left the building, and when asked to say a few words in French for the Canadian press, responded only with Bonne journée, Radio-Canada, a polite but unmistakably guarded brush-off. LeBlanc, speaking to reporters shortly after, struck a more measured tone, saying simply that Canada would continue working. Carney himself, speaking to reporters in St. John's that same day, confirmed he expected to speak with Trump personally before the Wednesday deadline, though he declined to elaborate on what a good outcome would actually look like for Canada. We'll have opportunities over the next 48 hours to discuss in more detail as the negotiations go forward, Carney said, and I think that's the best forum. Later that day, in additional remarks reported by CBC News, Carney described the state of talks as very delicate and intense, language notably more urgent than the constructive tone he had used earlier in the month. Shuvaloy Majumdar, the conservative critic for Canada-U.S. relations, offered a rare moment of cross-party unity in his own comments to reporters, saying that Ottawa's political class was broadly aligned in wanting a resolution with what he called an often unpredictable administration in Washington. We have grown tired, Majumdar said, of seeing our country used as a punching bag. That comment landed as a fairly accurate summary of the mood across the political spectrum in Ottawa by mid-August. Even lawmakers who rarely agreed on domestic policy seemed to converge on a shared frustration with the unpredictability coming out of Washington, the sense that positions could shift overnight, that a framework discussed on a Tuesday could look completely different by Thursday, and that Canada's negotiators were often reacting to decisions made unilaterally rather than shaping them jointly. It's a dynamic that trade specialists have pointed to repeatedly throughout this entire 18-month stretch of tension. Unlike a traditional trade negotiation, where both sides typically work from a shared draft text moving toward ratification, this process has unfolded more like a running negotiation under constant threat of new unilateral action, with formal agreements taking a back seat to executive proclamations that can be signed and in theory reversed at any time. That structure gives the White House considerable flexibility, but it also means that whatever gets agreed to before the August 19th deadline may not represent a final resolution so much as the next chapter in an ongoing negotiation, one that could just as easily reopen the next time a new sector, a new complaint, or a new proclamation puts Canada back in the spotlight. As of the most recent reporting available, negotiations remain unresolved. Sources briefed on the talks describe an atmosphere that is simultaneously hopeful and precarious. Hopeful because both sides are still actively negotiating rather than walking away, and precarious because the deadline arrives with several of the thorniest disputes, particularly around autos and forestry, still unsettled. Brian Clough, former deputy chief of staff who advised previous Canadian governments on relations with Washington, offered a cautious read on the situation, saying that the very fact both sides were still talking this intensely meant, in his words, there's a real chance for a deal, while also warning that a real chance is not the same thing as a guarantee. It's worth pausing here to be precise about what has and has not actually happened, because that distinction matters. As of this recording, no final agreement between Canada and the United States has been confirmed or signed. The 50% tariffs authorized under Section 338 remain scheduled to take effect at 1 minute past midnight on August 19th, unless a deal is reached before then. Reports describing the shape of a possible deal, lower tariffs on autos, steel, aluminum, and forestry in exchange for Canadian concessions on alcohol, dairy, and procurement, are based on sources familiar with the negotiations, not on any official confirmation from either government. Whether Prime Minister Carney could actually sell such an agreement to Canadians, and whether premiers like Doug Ford and David Eby would accept the provincial concessions it would require, remains, as multiple outlets have reported, an open question. What is confirmed is the sequence that got Canada here. A routine Premier's Summit in Charlottetown became the unlikely staging ground for one of the most aggressive tariff actions the United States has taken against Canada in decades. A law untouched for 70 years was suddenly back in active use. 13 premiers, who don't always agree with each other or with Ottawa, found themselves forced into the same room, arguing over how hard to push back against a trading partner that has, for generations, been treated as Canada's closest ally. And in the weeks since, through hydro deals in Newfoundland, tense meetings in Washington, and public warnings from a Bank of Canada governor, the country has been navigating a negotiation where the stakes are measured in tens of billions of dollars and, according to at least one industry estimate, well over 100,000 jobs. Before wrapping up, it's worth being transparent about where this story stands and what remains uncertain. The verified facts here come from named checkable sources: CBC News, CTV News, BNN Bloomberg, The Globe and Mail, Bloomberg, Al Jazeera, NBC News, courts, and the White House's own published fact sheet, along with on-the-record statements from Prime Minister Carney, Premier Doug Ford, Premier Scott Moe, Premier David Eby, Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc, U.S. Trade Representative Jameson Greer, and Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre. What remains genuinely unverified, as of this recording, is the final outcome. Whether a deal is reached before the August 19th deadline, what exact concessions each side will actually accept, and whether Canada's premiers will unanimously back whatever framework Ottawa agrees to. None of that has been settled. Anything you hear elsewhere claiming a final deal has already been signed should be treated with real skepticism, unless it's confirmed by Ottawa or Washington directly. If you've been following this trade fight for a while, you'll know this isn't the first deadline Canada and the United States have stared down together, and it may not be the last. But the moment in Charlottetown was different in one specific way. It stripped away any illusion that trade talks between these two countries could stay routine. A Premier's Summit built around healthcare and wildfires turned, almost overnight, into the moment Canada's provincial and federal leaders had to decide together whether to bend or to hold the line. So here's the question worth sitting with. When your closest trading partner reshapes the terms of the relationship with the stroke of a pen, and does it in a way that disrupts your own domestic politics, what actually counts as winning? Is it avoiding the tariffs altogether, even if it means real concessions on dairy and alcohol? Or is it standing firm, absorbing short-term economic pain in exchange for not being seen to fold? Canada's premiers didn't agree on the answer in Charlottetown, and it's not clear the country has settled on one now either. What do you think Canada should actually be willing to give up, if anything, to get this resolved? Drop your take in the comments. This is exactly the kind of story where hearing different perspectives adds something real. So if you've got a view from inside one of the affected industries, or just a gut read on where this ends up, it's worth sharing. If this kind of on-the-ground breakdown of how trade decisions actually unfold, not just the headlines, but the meetings, the leverage points, and the political pressure behind them, is useful to you, consider subscribing so you don't miss how this particular story ends, because the August 19th deadline is going to resolve one way or another very soon. And if you know someone who's been affected by these tariffs directly, in the auto sector and forestry and agriculture, or just as someone watching grocery and liquor store prices shift, send this their way. It's the kind of story that lands differently depending on where you're sitting, and getting more perspectives into the conversation is part of what makes this useful. Finally, if there's a specific angle on this trade fight you want covered in more depth, the dairy quota fight, the auto sector specifically, or what happens next if the deadline passes without a deal, leave that in the comments too, because that's genuinely where future coverage on this gets shaped. Thanks for watching, and we'll be back with an update the moment there's real, confirmed movement out of Ottawa or Washington.